sit behind the puppeteers, because you don't realize how hard they're working back here. I mean, we're all over the place trying to figure out what to do. I was nervous for them. It was truly really difficult to get out of bed this morning. I set my alarm and it actually woke up before, and then I turned it off, and then I went back to sleep, and I thought, oh my goodness, kind of running behind, because it's been a long 3 days. And it reminded me of this mother who went to wake her son up for church one Sunday morning. She knocked on the door and she said, hey, it's time to get up. And he said, well, I'm not going. And she asked, well, why not? And he said, well, I'll give you 2 good reasons why I'm not going. Number 1, they don't like me. Number 2, I don't like them. And his mother replied, well, I'll give you 2 good reasons why you will go to church today. 1, you're 47 years old. And 2, you're the pastor. That happened to me about 10 years ago, I think. True confession number 1. Some days I do feel like I'm a little bit out of commission. Now, you know what it means to be out of commission. It means that something is not in service. It's not in working order. A person is unable to work or function properly. It's out of commission. And right now, I must say that I could use a little R&R. I really could. A little tired. But I am not out of commission in terms of being your pastor, but I might be out of commission in terms of what we call the Great Commission. How many of you have heard of the Great Commission through Sunday school and that confirmation class that you didn't pay attention in and that sort of thing? The Great Commission is found in our gospel lesson today. It's from Matthew 28, specifically verse 19. And here it is straight from Jesus' mouth. He said, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Now that last part you will recognize as the Trinitarian formula. And that formula is found a few places in the Bible, and that's why it's included on our reading today, because this is Trinity Sunday. But let me give you a little word about the Great Commission. Historically, it has been interpreted in many ways, but I guess kind of the 2 more interesting ones, what I call the bookend views of the Great Commission. First, there are the preterists. Do we have any good preterists in the house today? They believe that the Great Commission was fulfilled during the 1st century. That is, they go out and make disciples, convert the world, basically. And then you have the futurists on the other end of the spectrum who believe that it will be fulfilled at the second coming. And so you can take your pick, or you can choose something somewhere in between. And I know Jesus said to do this, make disciples of all nations and baptize everyone. But when you think about it, that's a pretty tall order. I mean, not even the Pope has the power and the authority and the ability to make all disciples out of all the nations and baptize them in the name of the Trinitarian formula. He just can't. And yet most preachers and teachers and street evangelists tell us, this is what Jesus wants us to do, to go out and make disciples of all the nations. And they do that sometimes with a great sense of urgency. It's like do or die. That is, if we don't obey the Great Commission and lead people to Christ, then people will die a spiritual death and we will be held responsible. That's kind of heavy when you think about it. So I'm going to give you my second confession. I have to admit, I don't get up every morning with the Great Commission, in mind. After many, many years in the preaching business, for some reason, I don't have that grave sense of do or die urgency. Maybe it's been beat out of me, I don't know. But in terms of the Great Commission, I feel like at times I'm out of commission. I'm out of commission. And really, so are you. Because that's our reality. That's just our reality. Now, on the other hand, if any of you get up each and every morning with the Great Commission on your mind, I would like to hear about your experiences, which no doubt includes a lot of frustration and aggravation and funny looks from people and slammed doors in your faces. So let me be clear about what I'm saying. There is nothing wrong with following the Great Commission, having that as some kind of guide in a general way. I mean, we are called to seek and make disciples and baptize people and so forth. That's part of what we do here, okay? We're clear on that. And yet I wonder, looking at the extreme way that Jesus said that, or the way it's recorded in Matthew, I wonder if in some ways that might hold us back a little bit from some really important work. I wonder if in some way focusing on the Great Commission might get us off track at times. Here's what I mean by that. Ask yourselves the question, is the Great Commission really a practical or healthy worldview to have in the 21st century? Especially when we consider what I spoke about last week, which is that we live in the most pluralistic moment so far in human history. That is, not only are we competing against other Christians for the souls of earnest disciples, we are also competing against entirely different religious traditions. And maybe even more relevant today, or becoming more relevant, we are competing against worldviews that include no religious affiliation whatsoever. So I wonder if Jesus came to us in the year 2017, would he issue such a commission as he did in the first century? Would he really say, make disciples of all nations, which really means to evangelize the world for Christianity as if other religions don't even exist, or they're not credible enough to allow people to practice them? Or do you think maybe the world is so different now that sensitivities about other religions has changed so much in our context that the Great Commission should perhaps be tempered a bit today? In other words, does the Great Commission apply to us in the very same way and to the same extent that it did in the first century or not? And I know some Christians are adamant that the Great Commission should apply to us in the very same way as it did in the first century. And yet, I'm fearful that I will be misunderstood here, but I'm going to say it anyway. I'm going to give you 4 reasons why we should, this may be too strong a word, but ignore the Great Commission. Or a better way to put it, I'm going to give you 4 reasons why we might want to temper our understanding and application of the Great Commission. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I just think we need maybe a more sober understanding of what it might mean for us today. So 4 things I want to point out. Number 1, Jesus wasn't talking to you and me when he gave the Great Commission. The Great Commission was given to the apostles. So let's not flatter ourselves. We're not Matthew, we're not John, we're not Peter, we're not Mary Magdalene, we're not any of those folks. Their context was very different. Whereas they had a new religion to get off the ground and get started, we do not have that same situation. And I think one of the biggest errors that we often make while reading the Bible is assuming that the author was writing for us directly today in whatever century we're living. Now, certainly there's general truth that we can garner even from things that seem out of context and seem like something that belongs way in the past. We can get some truth out of that, but we should always remember, that the original audience was 21 centuries and half a world away. And that should mean something. That means we got to think clearly about things and grapple with things from the Bible. Number 2, people in the ancient world had very different expectations. For example, we read in the book of Acts. We've been studying the book of Acts on Monday evenings. It's been pretty interesting. But we read there that Paul heals a lame man. Ananias cures a blind man, again, with no modern medical technology. And furthermore, Peter raises someone from the dead. And we are told that everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. We no longer have those expectations, do we? I certainly hope you don't have those expectations of me to do that sort of thing. So whereas Jesus and his contemporaries may have expected to make disciples of all nations and baptize every person in their region, their world, we no longer have that expectation, do we? I'll speak more about that in a second. Number 3, sometimes the Bible teaches things that are really no longer applicable to us today in a literal, direct way. For example, and you could glean many examples from the Bible. You know this. A literal reading of the Bible suggests that God supports slavery, bigotry, polygamy, patriarchy, which is a male dominance, homophobia, sexism, genocide, and human sacrifice, just to name a few. But those things do not translate very well into modern Western society, do they? And I think the same might be said about the kind of aggressive evangelism implied in the Great Commission. Now, you've been in the UCC for a while. You may remember years ago, we talked about the E word because we were a little skittish about evangelism, or we have been most of our history, because our method of evangelism is waiting for the boats to come over from Germany, right? And that's been our method of evangelism for a long time. No longer happens, right? So we've been a little skittish about the E word. And we often compare that evangelism, we think of those groups that go door to door or knock on doors and are very, very aggressive about that. So if pushing our beliefs, which is we're not comfortable with, if pushing our beliefs on others doesn't always feel right, then like slavery, bigotry, polygamy, patriarchy, homophobia, sexism, genocide, human sacrifice, go on and on, maybe it isn't right to push our beliefs that way in such an aggressive fashion. Now again, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Evangelism in and of itself is a good thing. We are commissioned, we are called to introduce people to God the way we know God through Jesus Christ. But should we take this to the extreme of the Great Commission? That's the question. And then number 4, finally, it's simply not everyone's job to evangelize. You know, one of the keen insights of the Bible, particularly from the writings of the Apostle Paul, is that we all have different gifts. And so the truth is, you may not be called or gifted to be an evangelist, even to your neighbors, much less the nations, although I would argue that you and I should always be open to sharing the gospel with others. Your spiritual gifts, however, might lie somewhere else. You might contribute to the church in a different way than through evangelism, and that's okay. So those are just 4 reasons why we should perhaps take a step back and think about the Great Commission in a more sober way. Again, I stress, we should be evangelists and we should be open to sharing our faith, but we should not beat ourselves up if we cannot convert the entire world, because we're not going to. It's never going to happen. So get rid of the guilt you might have because you can't make the world Christian, much less your neighborhood, and even much less your own families. I bet most of us have in our larger families, there are many people in those families that are not churched people. We're not even successful, in other words, evangelizing our own families, much less our neighborhoods and much less the world, right? So instead, maybe we need to think about this in more practical terms. You and I are not out of commission. We just need a more contemporary commissioning. We need to be commissioned to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. We need to be commissioned to love God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love our neighbors as ourselves. We need to be commissioned to bring good news to the poor and proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free. We need to be commissioned to feed the hungry, give thirst to the thirsty, or give drink to the thirsty, welcome the stranger, clothe the naked, take care of the sick, and visit the prisoner. And I guarantee if we do all that, we will make disciples.